How many encoding ladders do you have for a typical piece of content?
So the way we define, when you say how many encoding ladders, you mean sort of like different variations of encoding ladders, or do you mean like steps within the ladder?
Different variations of encoding ladders.
Literally looking at the spreadsheet right now, and I think it's about 6 or 8 different variations right now. And so what we've tried to do is build an encoding ladder where, depending on the source resolution, we don't have to necessarily have different permutations of the ladders. And so, we have sort of a UHD ladder where, depending on what the source resolution is, that determines kind of where you stop in that ladder, but doesn't change the ladder necessarily itself. Where the permutations come in is things like frame rate. So if the source is 25p or 30p or 24p, that's gonna go and use a different ladder than if the source is 50p or 60p. Because that is one of the things we've done for Macs that wasn't supported before. For example, is high frame rates. So previously everything was capped at 30 FPS, and most of that was due to the fact that there wasn't really a lot of source content on HBO Max, for example, that required more than 30 FPS. But now that the content libraries of Discovery Plus and HBO Max are combined, right, there's a lot more reality TV on the Discovery Plus side. A lot of that is shot at 50 FPS if it's abroad, or 60 FPS if it's US. And so we wanted to preserve that temporal resolution as much as possible. And so we've started to support high frame rates as well. And so we have different encoding ladders for different frame rates. And then, of course, there's different encoding ladders for SDR versus HDR. And even within HDR, we have different encoding ladders for HDR10 versus Dolby Vision 5, for example.
What about for different devices? So if I'm watching on my smart TV and then I transition to my smartphone, am I seeing the same ladder, or do you have different ladders for different devices?
At this moment, they're the same ladders for all the devices. We might deliver different subsets of the ladder for certain devices, and so, but that's typically capping on the high end of the ladder. So, if, for example, some device cannot handle 60 FPS, or if it cannot handle resolutions above 1080p, for example, then we might intentionally cap the manifest itself that we're delivering to that device. But in terms of different bill rates and different encodings, we're not differentiating it yet between different devices. It's so I'll give you my personal take on that question, which is that in most cases, it's not really necessary, in my opinion, to have different encoding ladders for different devices, because your 1080p should look great no matter whether you're watching it on a iPhone or Apple TV. And so having 2 different 1080p encodes doesn't necessarily make sense. I've definitely heard people say, well, perhaps on the lower end of the bill rate ladder, right, where you have your lower bill rates, lower resolutions, that's where you need to have differentiation. But again, in my opinion, there's no harm in delivering 100, 200 kilobit per second bill rates in a manifest to a smart TV, because most likely it's never going to play it. And so you can put in the manifest, you can deliver it to the TV or to the streaming stick. In vast majority of cases, it's never even going to touch that bill rate. It's just going to skip right over it, go straight for the HD and the UHD.
Right.
And the only times you might ever see that low bill rate is if something catastrophic happens to your network and the player struggles so badly and needs to drop down to that level.